very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's nice to be in a slightly different environment and speaking to in some sense, a new set of people. I'm not actually going to project anything, so I'm not going to have Elliot's problem. You've got to look at me. I'll be looking at a few of my notes here, but I'm not going to put anything on the screen. I, as of July 1st, took over the role as Chief Commissioner of the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what that body is. But I should say at the outset that I am going to be speaking a little bit about the role of ICAI in the scrutiny architecture within the UK. But I should say that I actually have 3 other independent commissioners who sit with me on the board of ICAI, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity here today. I hope not too far from the things that they might say, but they are not here able to correct me on some things, so I want to make it very clear that I am speaking personally. I think it goes without saying that there's been a real sort of explosion of evaluative activity in the area of international development over the last probably decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. Elliot might correct me there. We've really gone from a situation in which there were a number of important but fairly isolated institutional evaluation units, mainly within the multilateral development system, some within the bilateral development system, to actually a real plethora of bodies engaged in evaluation. And actually that's a really nice place to be. Some might say that international development came a little bit late to that party. Maybe that's the case, but I think now we're in a really interesting space where we have really an extraordinary range of evaluation, from the most rigorous research-intensive type evaluations involving experimental and quasi-experimental methods, all the way through to systematic reviews, value for money studies, and the rest. And actually quite a lot of what you might call grey evaluation literature, which sort of stands in between some of the more formal traditions of evaluation, but nevertheless plays an important role. We don't always know it's there, but I think it plays an important role and needs to be given some consideration. The UK itself within international development has also become an incredibly important investor in development evaluation within international development. And I think it would be fair to say that the Department for International Development did come late to that party, actually, but has now really made up considerable ground in terms of investing both in terms of its own evaluation knowledge and also being an investor in the global evaluation enterprise, contributing to the sort of public good dimensions of evaluation. So that's all very positive. Of this significant body of work in evaluation, an important percentage of that work is really there for what you might call pure accountability purposes. But I would venture that actually that's a very small percentage compared to the amount of evaluation that really is part of this tradition of trying to understand and learn to build the evidence base on which future international development practice can be based. So actually I would venture to say that the sort of learning dimensions of evaluation has really taken off in the last number of years. And while the very important role of evaluation in accountability remains, it is now set against a much bigger ambition to use evaluation to understand what works and why, to inform better practice in the future. At the same time as this sort of explosion of evaluative activity, there is actually now a very real and tangible demand, particularly here in the UK, but not exclusively so, from the wider public, from parliamentarians, to have evidence that helps them justify the commitments that the UK has made to its aid budget, which of course you will all know reached 0.7% of GNI in the last couple of years, to assess the value for money of aid spending, and, if you like, to help manage the risks that are widely associated with the aid effort abroad. The idea that, because this is a fairly remote venture of delivering overseas development assistance to developing countries, that there are inevitable risks associated with that, and many of those involved in, particularly in the public domain, want some level of assurance that those risks are being effectively managed. And this, of course, is part of the hunger for assurance. There is a real hunger for assurance, particularly from parliamentarians, but not exclusively, that this aid money is being used well and effectively. And that's in a way where the Independent Commission for Aid Impact kind of enters the scene. Let me just say a few words about its genesis, for those of you who don't know. It was launched in May 2011 as a non-departmental public body. Now, in the old days, that might have been called a quango. We've lost that terminology. But essentially, it's a body that sits outside of government, but provides a certain function to government. And in ICAI's case, that is to provide assurance on the value for money of UK aid and its overall effectiveness. ICO's role, if you like, is to provide independent scrutiny of UK aid spending, which includes primarily looking at the work of the Department for International Development, but because we are responsible for looking at all UK ODA, we're also engaging with other spending departments across government, those who have small ODA budgets, which would include, for example, the Department for Energy and Climate, the Department for Business and Innovation and Skills, and so on. If you look at what we were asked to do, ICAI's mandate, it has three elements. The first is to produce a range of independent, high quality and accessible reports that set out the evidence on impact and value for money of UK development efforts. Secondly, to work with and for Parliament to help boost the UK government to account for its development programme and to make information on this programme available to the public. And thirdly, to produce appropriately targeted recommendations to be implemented and followed by the UK government. So ICAI reports to the International Development Select Committee in Parliament, and this was an innovation in 2011, where there was a feeling that what was needed to give additional bite, if you like, to the work of the Commission was a reporting line that went straight into Parliament that would then support the efforts of the International Development Select Committee to hold the Department for International Development and other ODA spending departments to account. It's worth noting that actually the Independent Commission for Aid Impact is really pretty unique within aid-giving countries. There is actually at the moment no other body that has quite the form that ICAI does. We've had a lot of countries sort of interested in this body, but as yet it doesn't have an analogue in other parts of the system. This is in some ways quite a nice position to be in, but it's also a huge challenge and a huge responsibility. So let me just say a little bit about the sort of interesting space that we occupy. Because as a scrutiny body, we have to walk the line, if you like, between engaging with this sort of demand for assurance, while at the same time needing to fulfill certain basic standards around how evidence is gathered and how judgments are made about the effectiveness of the UK aid programme. And scrutiny is not exactly the same thing as evaluation. But I think I'm quoting Eliot when I say, well, it's part of a broad church of evaluative activity, but it's not entirely the same thing. And scrutiny, if you like, has been an expanding area of public life, particularly in the UK, I would argue. It's not the same as necessarily as audit. It can be something a little bit different. It's not really the same as parliamentary inquiry. And there are very high expectations on scrutiny that it will help build public trust. And in fact, that speaks very much to a point that Elliot made about the kind of background of declining trust within public institutions and public policy making generally. And of course, within the aid world, trust is a huge issue. Confidence is a huge issue. So actually, there's an expectation that scrutiny, and in the case, that very much speaks to our mandate, can help somehow contribute to building trust. It's a huge challenge, of course. At the same time, I think it would be fair to say, for those who kind of spend their time looking at these things carefully, there are also some quite recognised challenges around scrutiny and what it contributes. There may be a lot of it, but not all of it is equally effective or equally meaningful. There is a bit of a tendency within scrutiny to focus mainly on process. Now, process is important. How things are done and managed and delivered is really important. But I think it's also fair to say that those who are scrutinised, who are at the receiving end of scrutiny, can often end up focusing a lot of their time on being fit for scrutiny rather than being fit for purpose. So the slight obsession with process sometimes can get in the way of purpose. And that is clearly something that I think we should all be seeking to avoid. It's not always the case that within scrutiny bodies there's a really clear articulation of methodology or methods that seem to conform with accepted evaluative standards. And this is something I think that goes well beyond scrutiny within the aid business, but much more broadly. And there can at times be perceived to be a bit of a missing middle between method and conclusions or findings, that there isn't a clear understanding of the mechanisms through which scrutiny bodies arrive at their findings and judgments. So it's really important that, and I take this as a learning point for us in ICAI, that we're very clear about the process whereby we build on methods and draw conclusions. But I think it's a fair challenge to any scrutiny body that they need to attend to the risk of this sort of missing middle. And of course there is another challenge broadly to scrutiny bodies, which is about, how do you actually see yourself as influencing those that you scrutinise? What are the modalities through which you seek to gain influence? What is your model of change, if you like? And having myself worked in the think tank sector, I know very much, and I'm looking at Louise here too, that we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we influence and models of engagement and so forth. And we know that influencing is an incredibly non-linear and often quite political process. And scrutiny bodies often exist kind of assuming that, you just fire out your conclusions and somebody's there ready to receive them and that's influence. Well, it is a bit more complicated than that. So I think, again, a genuine challenge to scrutiny bodies is, what is your own model of change or influence? Now, just going back a little bit to the mandate of the Independent Commission, the Independent Commission was reviewed, its work was reviewed in 2013. I should say, I didn't say this at the beginning, which I should, is that I and my commissioners only took over in July this year, so we are the sort of second commission to sit in this body. But in 2013 there was a very interesting review of the work of the Independent Commission, and the reason I'm raising this is that I think it tried to clarify what the space was that ICAI was occupying within UK evaluation, but also more importantly scrutiny scene. And it was very clear that ICAI has a key function to play. It's very clear that its independence really matters, and we take that incredibly seriously. But it was also very clear that what we're not in the business of doing are full-blown evaluations or investigations or inquiries that you might see a select committee doing. What we do is occupy the space in between those two things. And there is a strong expectation that in doing that, we are of high quality, that we consider depth, not necessarily breadth, that we are professionally credible and accessible, and that we ensure that the lessons learned from our work are shared as widely as possible. That was the expectation set out in the triennial review of ICAI. Now that's got a lot to live up to. How we square all those expectations of us, not being pure evaluation, which we simply are not set up to do, high quality, professionally credible, accessible, with holding to account while at the same time providing lessons learned. That's a fairly demanding set of expectations, and it raises a number of key challenges for us, which I'd like to just spend a bit of time on now, because I think they speak more broadly to this issue of the contribution of scrutiny stroke evaluation to public policy. The crucial thing is, in order for us to be professionally credible, we do need a methodological approach that meets certain basic standards. Basic standards around being systematic, being objective, being obviously well evidence-based, being willing to speak truth to power, so willing to take on the difficult issues and speak frankly and in an unbiased and impartial way. But at the same time, we mean to do that and remain very accessible for potentially a lay audience. Now remember, our members of Parliament sitting on the International Development Select Committee come to their work with very different experiences and backgrounds, and what they need from us is to know that we are technically robust and rigorous, but at the same time very accessible, so that they can engage thoroughly and comprehensively with our work. That sounds a lot easier than it is, and we constantly have to attend to that balance between investing methodologically in technique and so forth, and making sure that we're able to produce highly accessible evidence. I'm of the view that there isn't a trade-off between those two things, but we just need to attend constantly to make sure we avoid overly technical jargon amongst other things. It's also the case, I think, that the skills needed to support, a more learning-based approach are not necessarily those things that you would the same skills that you use for a pure accountability approach, and we need to again balance between those two requirements. For me, learning and accountability are not two different tracks. They're very much two sides of the same coin, but the skill sets one needs to do both well are not always in plentiful supply. So again, we need to attend very carefully to that. My own view on this is that we partly achieve a coming together of learning and accountability by shortening our feedback loops, having as much real-time engagement as we can, not only with our parliamentary committee, but also with the Department for International Development and other spending departments, so that we're constantly engaging around not only our review questions, but also our key findings, and that we take a very pragmatic approach to our choice of methods. We also have to face that very old chestnut, which is particularly profound, I think, in the aid business, which is that we need to provide scrutiny while not being seen to completely undermine the case for UK aid. Now, I say this because actually you probably will have noticed, or you may not, that very often where there is bad news in relation to UK aid, there tends to be a pretty strong call from certain parts of the media and elsewhere for this enterprise to be shut down. There are not so many other areas of public policy where I would say that's also true. I mean, we hear bad news about the National Health Service all the time. The response tends not to be, except from perhaps some extreme quarters, well, we should shut the NHS. It tends to be, we need to do better, we need to invest more in, understanding what works, and we need to invest. In the aid business, we tend to get these really quite major negative reactions, which is when there is challenging news or a suggestion that things could be done better, there's a sense of, well, we need to, this enterprise is fundamentally flawed. And that makes it a really quite difficult place to provide clear, balanced scrutiny. We mustn't, in the Independent Aid, Commission for Aid Impact, be affected by that, but we have to be aware that that is the context in which we're operating. So our language and our modes of communication really matter. And maybe at some point we could discuss a bit more about that. A key challenge, I think, for us is also, in response to what I think is a fairly reasonable challenge around scrutiny, is for us to try and focus as much as possible on the purposes of UK aid as much as the processes of UK aid. And I take that to mean that we, in our pursuit of assessing value for money, need to take the value bit very, very seriously and to push ourselves along to assessing how UK aid is contributing to outcomes and impacts as much as possible. Now, I think it is Michael Scriven's nice typology of evaluation as moving from through merit, worth to value, I think. Well, I think we need to push very much from being a scrutiny body that looks at merit to one that also looks and tests significance or worth, i.e., what's this all for, and is it really living up to its aspirations to produce developmental impact. And one of the things we're going to try and do over the next 4 years is to focus a bit more of our attention on the extent to which DFID and other spending departments are able to demonstrate sustainable impact from the work that they do. That means building on the evidence and evaluation base that DFID is already producing for itself to demonstrate impact. Our role is to test the veracity of those impact claims, not to go off and do entirely separate impact evaluation. We exist to scrutinise the veracity of results claims, not to do completely independent primary evaluation. But it's really important that we push ourselves to testing the merit of those results claims on not only focusing on the processes by which DFID and other spending departments try to deliver results. We want to build on existing knowledge and contribute to learning, and to do so we take very seriously the theories of change that DFID works with and wanting to put those through a certain amount of scrutiny. As I said, we want to test the validity of results claims, and we also want to stress test the evidence base, the quality of the evidence, the production of evidence, the evidence gaps that are currently operating inside DFID, and to ask ourselves whether this actually meets our expectations of being able to evidence change, to learn, and to build on what works. As I said, because we want to contribute to learning, because we need to make sure that we're accessible, we are needing to consider how we maintain these feedback loops with various stakeholders. We need to make sure we're being very relevant and timely in the way in which we produce reviews. And how we do that is partly by consulting widely, but also by making sure that we're we have a number of formal set-piece interactions with the Department for International Development to help us do that. And just maybe a couple more points before I close. I think there is an expectation that we will want to recommend what should be done differently based on our reviews. And I think there was a lot of that in the first phase of ICI, and a lot of it, very importantly, pointed to things that the Department for International Development particularly could do differently. But I want to float the idea that I think we also need to be considering that sometimes, particularly for a scrutiny body, producing strong and clear findings may be as influential as then moving to try and recommend what should be done differently. So we're looking in the next 4 years also to sort of mix that up a bit, because I sense that our ability to produce findings with a view to others taking on board what needs to be done may be as powerful as us needing to push forward recommendations. We'll see how that goes. It may be that the Parliamentary Committee doesn't really like that very much and we need to adjust. But I think there is merit in thinking about scrutiny as the ability to come to the point where you make clear findings and allow others to take forward potential recommendations and implications. Most importantly of all, we have to be really careful in this, walking this line between scrutiny and evaluation, learning and accountability, that we don't water down our independence. Our independence is absolutely vital to the sense of trust and confidence in what we do. We've also got to draw, to guard that, we also need to draw a really important distinction between the work we do around scrutinising UK aid and assessing the quality of the evidence base, the quality of the evaluation base on which decisions are being made to improve impact of UK aid, from the policy formulation process, from the policy choices and decisions that might be made on the basis of some of the evidence that we provide. It's really important that we retain that distinction. We are not in the policy development business, we are in the scrutiny business, and therefore it's really important that we don't get caught through our attempts to engage and offer lessons learned in the business of moving too close to policy formulation. The worst case scenario being that we end up in that space otherwise known as policy-based evidence making. That's certainly not where we want to go. We have to retain that distinction, and it's really important we do so. So I suppose ICI is considered to be a watchdog. We were established as an aid watchdog. It's a term that is widely used in the press when they report on our conclusions. My feeling is that we continue to be a watchdog, but we also need to recognise that in doing that, we have to invest a little bit in being a guide dog too, that we are a watchdog stroke guide dog, in that we are looking to draw lessons out of the work we do that we hope will feed back into the overall effort to improve the value for money and the effectiveness of UK aid. Thank you.